With the price of the base Switch consoles recently being increased in the USA, all the signs are that the 2017 Marvel now has dynamite ticking underneath it. In certain respects, a swift transition to a Switch 2, if it can be achieved, would make a huge amount of sense for Nintendo. The ideal must be to lock in those tens of millions of players of the new generation as quickly as possible, guaranteeing therefore a large audience for the next decade for Nintendo's many endeavours. But this will take time, and it also leaves conspicuously absent the very bottom of the market, the people who will struggle to afford an expensive new system. In 2019, when the Switch Lite hit the marketplace, it was still relatively expensive as an offering, but it also was not the only game system Nintendo had to offer in the lower price category. The new 2DS XL, released mere months after the original Switch, was $150, and the absolute bare bones bottom of the pile offering, the 2DS, was a mere $80. Today, the equivalent of that is a little north of $100, but it's a price point that Nintendo just doesn't seem to be able to reach anymore. And to be fair, even then, the 2DS was an absolutely stunning deal for anybody who wanted a cheap entry point console for a young child. It's not even that 2DS sold a huge number. Its last major year on sale was the 2019 to 20 financial year, where it shifted 200,000 units after a year where it moved 880,000, and then before that, the first full financial year after the Switch was launched, where the 2DS sold 2 million. The thing is, though, this was more than the 3DS XL, and while it was not as significant as the 2DS XL numbers, they were a significant chunk for a console that was older and had far less promotion. It spoke to the enduring appeal of a low-price entry-level system, and I actually suspect that the overall value to Nintendo was far higher of getting people who might otherwise be priced out of the Nintendo ecosystem and bringing them in for hopefully the long term. That's people who will grow up to buy more Nintendo stuff and potentially share Nintendo content with their children and grandchildren. Which makes me think, could there be an ultra cheap version of the Switch released? For a million or perhaps even a few 100,000 units, it wouldn't be worth it to Nintendo, and it might seem like an odd choice to have a new version of the Switch release alongside their newest and most advanced console. But this transition isn't like the 3DS to the Switch. The Switch 2 is essentially the same ecosystem. As long as people are on Switch, they can still be a part of Nintendo Switch Online. They can still play a vast library of games that are in many cases still being supported and upgraded and promoted through the Nintendo Switch 2 program, and they can even utilize some Switch 2 functionalities through game chat and game share features that are broadcast out from a Switch 2. In 2019, it made sense to definitively move on from a console ecosystem, the 3DSs, that would become more and more expensive to maintain than it would be to put to bed. But for Nintendo, the Switch still has a lot of potential appeal. Now, maintaining multiple manufacturing lines for currently 4 systems will become costly, and I would expect them to shut down the existing lines in due course. And Nintendo could, of course, just leave the Switch Lite behind, even if they end the Switch and Switch OLED production. At $230 currently in the US terms, it's about the cheapest you're going to get outside the second-hand market, but it's still not exactly an entry-level price. So let's try to imagine what a true bargain basement system could be. For argument's sake, let's call it Switch Pocket. As the name suggests, the screen size would be smaller even than the Lite. This would have some problematic elements. I found Fire Emblem Three Houses quite difficult to read in places, even on my 2017 Switch, so I dread to think how a smaller screen would cope with this, but the fact is that Nintendo is fairly relaxed about having a small minority of games not be so easily accessible on their system variants. They released Super Mario Party in October 2018 and only 11 months later put out the Switch Lite, while confirming that some of that game's features would not translate over. There are lists of Switch games which won't work on Switch 2. In this case, it's not even that the game wouldn't run, it just wouldn't be a very comfortable experience unless they patch in accessibility options for the text, which they really should be doing anyway, and for all I know, they may have done in the 5 or 6 years since that game first released. The 2DS XL screen was 4.88 inches and the Switch Lite's is 5.5 inches. Let's say they settle out at 5 inches, a 10% smaller screen. They could also dip the resolution of the screen to 540p. At that size, it would be a visible dip from 720, but not a massive one, and many games such as Witcher 3 run at 540 in handheld in any event. Again, there may be compatibility issues with titles that are not able to be rendered at the lower resolution in a way that looks too flattering. I'm not technical, so although my guess is that going down in resolution would be slightly easier than going up, it might be prohibitively costly for Nintendo to allow for this. Since the Switch 2 already runs Switch through a solution that is part emulation, could it even be that they have a new chip that is slightly less powerful than the Switch's, perhaps with some games requiring Wi-Fi so the game can be at least partly streamed? I don't think Nintendo would get this fussy for what would be at the end of the day a relatively small seller, but let's look at more practical changes they could make to reduce the cost of the system they're creating. With the screen that much smaller and with the ability of many newer consoles to have much smaller bezels, the whole chassis of the Switch Lite could be slimmed down significantly. If the whole machine could be made perhaps 20% smaller, that's less plastic, a smaller box, and more economical shipping. The price savings wouldn't be quite that, since the components would remain the same and indeed may need to be specifically made at a different size. So even if the overall footprint is considerably smaller, the price would not have that 20% dip just the same. However, there is more that could be done. They could remove the headphone port and rely on Bluetooth, remove the HD rumble. It's used quite commonly, but is rarely essential. They could use even smaller internal storage, and if the machine was smaller and less powerful, they may be able to get away with a less powerful battery as well. Look, I'm not going to try and break down the individual cost savings of any of these measures, as it would be pure guesswork, but it seems at least plausible that they could yank enough out of the system that it could go on the market as a significantly cheaper console than the Switch Lite. Let's say the bill of materials for Switch Lite is roughly $100, with assembly cost, retail margins, US tariff costs, Nintendo's profits, and so on, taking it up to the current retail price of $230. If they could shave $30 off these material costs, we'd be looking at a final retail price of potentially around $180. Now, we know that the Switch Lite is a model with a relatively high profit margin for the company, and tariffs would be less if they could get the wholesale price down. So perhaps they could afford even to squeeze it down to a final price of $150. I think in an ideal world, they would have loved an entry point at that was even lower, perhaps $129.99, but I think that is completely off the table. A $50 saving is a substantial dip from Switch Lite, but it may not feel quite huge enough for the hassle of creating a new system. But if they do a $150 model, then they would be releasing the Switch profit, if not at a loss, then certainly at margins so small it may hardly seem worth the bother. On the other hand, the margins on perhaps 2 or 3 million Switch Pockets would be a rounding error in Nintendo's overall balance sheet anyway, and while they don't take a loss leader approach to their hardware, they may feel, especially if the system is also digital only, that they can afford tiny margins if it draws people into the Nintendo ecosystem and they ultimately pay for a significant number of older games which have higher margins. Another risk, of course, is that the system cannibalizes the sales of the main console, but this is unlikely as well. Even if Nintendo continue to support the Switch indefinitely, as I expect they will, with NSO updates and small digital titles where it makes as much sense for them to be cross-platform as single-platform, all the prestige releases will still be going to Switch 2. Switch Pocket is never going to feel like a substitute for that, but it would represent an absolutely terrific deal for the consumer. If they were to launch a machine like this, my guess is that they would discontinue all three Switch lines at the end of the current financial year, save for a good amount of existing stock that they will have on hand and which would also be floating around retailer warehouses. They could also launch a Switch Pocket early in 2026, February to April, perhaps in Mario colours, ahead of the Mario movie. They could take the Mario Kart World approach and shoot for a higher price by taking a bit of a haircut on the software price, perhaps a $200 model with Super Mario Bros. Wonder as a download code. Since these would be designed to appeal to children primarily, it may be that if there's some success, they could do this with other franchises: Pikachu, Yoshi, DK, and Zelda models, each with preloaded games. The paint job, the packaging change, and the different download code would all be minor costs, but the added collectability would probably be an additional fillip to sales. And of course, if they can license Minecraft or Fortnite and get Switch pockets that are themed for these various franchises, this would be a siren call to a lot of younger players, especially in Japan, where the Switch version of Minecraft is especially successful. It might also be something they could use for newer markets, and especially as a way to enter countries that are either poorer outright or which don't have a major tradition of buying Nintendo consoles. If you look at 2DS XL, it launched in April 2017 and was effectively discontinued in April 2020, a 3-year window of time on the shelves during which time it sold a little shy of 5 million units. As far as I can tell, it was a pretty big success for Nintendo. Could the original Switch still be worth pushing for a further 3 years from now, especially when you consider all the movie and theme park audiences? Could it also scrape an extra 5 million with multiple models, a big push to a younger audience, and an aggressively competitive price point against a difficult economic backdrop? I think that's ambitious, but not out of the realms of possibility entirely. Nintendo also has a history of late-in-life console revisions. They still shifted 10,000 DSi's in the 2014 to 15 year, the 3DS's third full financial year on the market. And if the Switch 2's Lite version is still expensive, $350 or even $400 have to be plausible in a US context, bearing in mind tariff changes, then a $199.99 baseline console could actually be a very popular move. Ultimately, launching a new model of such a venerable console at this point could actually be a very popular move, and all the more popular if they can get that price down below the $200 margin. Ultimately, launching a new model of such a venerable console at this point would be kind of an extreme move, and so I can only give a new Switch model at this late point a 30% shout by the end of the next financial year, but I think at this point, if there is a new console, the obvious gap in the market is for a low cost model. Let me know what you think below. Please consider sharing this video if it's of interest, and there's a lot more on the channel's Patreon below if you'd like to check it out. Thank you so much for watching as ever, and I shall see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.